get familiar with this. All right. That's the pointer. Advance and so. How about the light?
Would you like to take your seat so we can start? Good evening, and welcome to our first in the series of Spring '85 Design Forum Public Lectures. A mailer will be reaching you, students and visitors, anyone who's on our mailing list, anyone who isn't on our mailing list and would like to be, call in and we'll send you one. This is our current announcement of our lectures this semester. Following our lecture this evening with At.Johansen will be a very short interval. Our next lecture is tomorrow night with Andy McMillan of the Glasgow School of Art talking about Macintosh. And the reason it's a Thursday night and tomorrow night is because that's when he's in town and that's when he could come, and I thought that would be a rather rare experience for us. Mr. McMillan is an architect, a member of one of Britain's most recognized large firms that recently received the RIBA medal. And as director of the Glasgow School, he is also an authority on Charles René Mackintosh. So I have asked him to talk about Mackintosh tomorrow night and perhaps show a few slides of his work as well. The following week, we will have the pleasure of having Rake Rietveld of Amsterdam, who will be spending 2 weeks at SCI-Arc teaching in the third year studio. Rake has been serving as adjunct faculty to our Vico Marcotte School, meeting and touring with our students who come to Holland. And he's on a tour of the east and west coasts, and he's going to be spending 2 weeks here and giving 2 consecutive lectures on the 6th and 13th of February. Speaking first on the building mechanism, a Dutch tradition, and the second week, an in-depth design problem illustrating those ideas. A lecture that has just been confirmed this morning, which will not appear on this mailer, will be given by Zaha Habib, who was the winner of the Hong Kong Peak competition last year. You may remember her exciting drawings that were published all over the world. She's coming to California because in San Francisco there's going to be a show of her drawings at the Philippe Bonifant Gallery in San Francisco, and will be coming down here to lecture on Thursday, the 21st of February. So that's an additional date that we'll be publicizing. I think that will be an exciting evening. She's someone who I've been wanting to bring, and so it was kind of providential when I got this call from San Francisco asking if we'd like to host her visit. And I, of course, said yes very quickly. The end of February, we will be having 2 lectures by Rainer Banham, historian, author, intellectual, wit, and observer. And he's been working on a new book and will be presenting some of his material dealing with the American Industrial Building, 1920 to 1925. That will be the first evening, a Tuesday night, February 26th. And the following night, he could only come for a 2-night tandem presentation rather than a 2-week tandem presentation, which I had originally proposed. The following night will be the European response to the industrial building, speaking in depth on the Vegas factory and the Fiat factories. So that, I think, will be a very interesting preview on a new publication by Banham. Then in March, things are continuing to develop. Again, will not appear on this poster that went to press last week. We have kind of a fast-breaking schedule, still breaking. The traveling studio that went to Japan last semester will be presenting a slide show reflecting their adventure that they had with new and old architecture of Japan, and that will be on March 6th, the Wednesday night. And the final lecture, as of today, will be on March 13th, the following Wednesday, with Geoffrey Baker, a British author who has written on Le Corbusier, talking about Le Corbusier and nature and organization of form. So that's our lecture series, and I hope you'll be joining us for the series. When we invite a speaker to come to speak here at SCI-Arc, we usually request a resume so we can give a proper introduction. When one asks At.Johansen for a resume, you get about a 1-inch thick portfolio because he has practiced for many years, he has been recognized, he's been published, and been involved in many interesting things. So what I'm going to present to you is a synthesis that's been made with John's help, telling you just kind of a tip of the iceberg resume of his background. His education was at Harvard, having studied with Gropius and Breuer. He is a fellow of the AIA, a member of the New York Architecture League, having been a former president. He was architect in resident at the American Academy in Rome, and was honored by being made a member, one of 12 architect members of the American Academy of Arts and Letters. His awards include a National AIA Award for the Oklahoma Theater and for the Roosevelt Island Neighborhood Complex. He is a teaching professor, has been a teaching professor at Yale, Columbia, and now at Pratt. His work has been much published throughout the world. His best-known buildings one might include such buildings as the United States Embassy in Dublin, Ireland, the Opera House in Indianapolis, the Oklahoma Theater Center, and again the Roosevelt Island neighborhood, which consists of 1,000 apartments, schools, swimming pools, shopping areas, a rather large complex. Recently, John has been doing some very thoughtful writing. For the American Scholar, he wrote Architecture for the Electronic Age. And in Architecture, the Journal of the AIA, last year, he wrote a very perceptive article entitled 3 Imperatives of Architecture. And it is on this topic that he will be addressing us tonight. We are very pleased to have with us tonight At.Johansen.
The last time I gave lectures in this area and around the country, the topic of my talk was the 12 indictments of postmodern. It went over really quite well. It was very funny and very disrespectful of most of the young cats. And I had a very good time as an old cat myself. So since that time, though, I'm now a few years older, more responsible, sort of the father figure, you might say. And I think my duties professionally are more to try to do something constructive, you see, instead of destructive, instead of rip things apart. Try to get back and offer some suggestion of how we might get the whole thing going again. You can understand I still disagree with most of postmodern, but this will be a serious talk, philosophical, and based on the article that did appear in the AIA Journal last year in March, the three imperatives of architecture. In that, I was trying to attempting to get back to some common ground, some basis of organization, or three derivations, you might say, from which we might begin to reconstruct a new architecture. Now, if you were to ask Rainer Banham, who will speak to you really very soon here, as I have, which of the present trends is most likely to endure, he will say with utter calm, high technology. If you were to ask Charles Jenks, as I have, the same question, he will say with equal conviction, postmodern, whatever that may be. Ada Louise Huxtable has played it more cautiously, attacking only the extremes of pomposity on the one hand and the orgies of rediscovery on the other. Bruno Zevi takes a more political and moral position of democratic liberalism and free inventiveness of spirit, as opposed to authoritarianism, the orders and rules of classic and neoclassic tradition. Generally, there has been felt in the last years, in the late 70s at least, a loss of direction and dedication, which was so strong in the 50s and 60s and 70s. Jose Sert spoke to me in the late 70s of a loss of faith. Moshe Safdie sees currently a need for a new professional ethic. Controversy and chaotic pluralism we observe in the architecture profession today. We might do well then to search for essential qualities, basic ingredients, and derivations for an architecture which can better perform its rightful service to the physical and psychic well-being of our society. First and last, architecture is a service art. For as Lewis Mumford says, there can be for architecture, unless it performs a service, there can be for architecture no purpose, no meaning, and no value. Now, that's not to say that architecture is not a good deal more than performance of service. But that's the distinct characteristic about the art of architecture, as opposed from easel painting or dance or whatever. It does perform a service. And you must start and end with that. That is one of the fundamental bases of architecture. So after foundering for some time in this professional slough, I have singled out three aspects of the human condition in which mankind has for some 6,000 years, is now, and probably always will be, inextricably bound, and whose influences upon mankind are so compelling that it seems appropriate to apply to them the term imperative. The three aspects, then, as I see them, are the technological imperative, the organic imperative, and the psychosocial imperative. Now, by definition, technology represents the practical and industrial arts, applied science. It has been the method and process of dealing with technical problems, problem solving. It has been the system by which society provides itself with those material things it needs and desires. Man from the very start has been the inquisitive animal, the animal that made tools, the animal that has the compulsion to search, invent, construct, and improve his physical environment. The animal uniquely equipped, not only with memory, but a sense of anticipation and vision of the future. Although there may be today some deplorable aspects of what Lewis Mumford has called the mega-technic wasteland, there can be no question as to what technology has achieved in the service of man. In medicine, transport, communication, education, industry, and exploration. Overwhelmingly, the response to technology, to technological advance through history has been that of immediate and extensive dissemination, broad public interest, and enthusiasm. Its prompt application to marketable commodities, and even its inspiration of artistic endeavors. As for its challenge to humanistic standards, we have a very strong defense against that. There has been some resistance to technology. It's seen strangely as some autonomous power that is against nature and against man, an evil thing. when in fact, if you listen to these quotes from these very important people, you will find that technology really is simply an extension of ourselves, is in fact humanity itself. Buckminster Fuller, the technologist, observed that the higher the technology, the greater the diversity of product and the greater the range and choice for society. Margaret Mead, the anthropologist, said that we need low, middle, and high technology to solve the problems of various peoples of this world community. Marcia McLuhan, the social observer of the electronic age, said that in order to control technology, we simply must accept it, but first to understand it, and then to control it. Norbert Wiener, in his book, The Human Use of Human Beings, writes that technology is simply the extension of the human mind and the human body. It is us. It is an extension of ourselves. It is not something else or opposed to us. The late microbiologist and humanist René Dubos was of the opinion that technology need not be incompatible with nature or humanism as long as we make technology conform to human needs and aspirations. And finally, Pierre Teilhard de Chardin, the French Jesuit priest, literally reconciles these two apparent opposites when he says that technology is an extended form of humanism. Humanism is, of course, the science which deals with the human being. Architecture, by its very nature and through its performance in each period of history, has been inseparable from the building technology of that period. All buildings are ipso facto structures. With few exceptions, all important buildings in history made full use of the highest technology known in their time. High technology in each time was displayed as a matter of pride by patrons representing the church, royalty, great families, and municipal governments. In 1966, in the American Scholar, that's a long time ago, the Architecture for the Electronic Age, goodness Lord, that's almost 20 years ago, I wrote these observations, which had to do with influences I felt upon architecture, which came from the electronic age. Briefly, these influences were the following. It might be imitation in the fact if we have, in the early years of modern, the machine aesthetic, when buildings were designed to look like machines, we may well have buildings that look like electronic equipment. However, they don't think that's very important. However, the organizing principles of electronic systems, comprising the chassis, the component, the subcomponent, and circuiting, it was, in fact, the basis of the organization of my design for the Oklahoma Theater Center. Computer graphics, mapping, image processing, and all of that is having a strong impact on architectural design. Communication itself, which McLuhan predicted would cause an implosion of information, therefore allow for an explosion of city planning and architectural design itself. Cybernetic techniques, of course, the controlling devices are another influence as well, another element of architecture. But most important of all, using electronic devices, as we do more and more, the television and all the rest of it, have actually and noticeably retrained all our perceptive habits. We are not the people we were, let me put it this way, your generation is so trained by exposure to electronic devices, your habits of perception are entirely different from mine, who were a generation older, and mine still different from my parents. So this then is a case McLuhan talks about of the machine or the electronic device that we conceive of and have control of. As we develop it, it turns around and has its effect upon us. It then has its influence upon us in reverse. It would be unnecessary to build this case for technology if it were not for the current confusion we find in the profession today. Some look upon building technology with utter disdain, giving it no presence, no expression, nor symbolism, and obscuring any evidence of the building process. Architects of this persuasion stand strangely apart from all history. As for technology, it is impossible to conceive of a society without it, or to develop in any time an architecture without it. Unlike the more constant derivations of architecture, that is, nature and the human psyche, technology is the factor which undergoes constant change, prompts new discovery, invention, improvement of the performance of this service art architecture. As a fact of historic record, then, it is in each time not only profoundly affected the general outlook of the society, but in each time initiated a new architectural vocabulary. To sum it all up, Alvin Toffler, the futurist, says that technology is the common heritage of the human race. The organic imperative. Teilhard has said this. He said, technology draws man into the systems of nature. It shows a very strong connection there, that the more we advance in our study of technology, the more we learn from nature, of having been there already and having set up systems by which she operates. Now, the conviction established in the life of primitive man, existent in the present and inevitably continuing into the future, is the awareness that man is part of nature rather than separate from nature. Primitive concern with shelter for survival, in the beginning the cave, and now in our sophisticated urban developments, brings into focus the relationships of man to his environment within this biosphere. Shelter is the fundamental purpose for which buildings are made. This timeless experience of being sheltered against adverse elements of nature, with all its technical solutions throughout history, and in spite of superficial styling, remains the strong element of architecture. Let's examine the word organic for a moment. From the dictionary, the word organic is defined as involving the basic makeup of things, as that which is made up of systematically interrelated parts. We speak of things being organized, and surely this applies to architecture. To organize something is to deal with the organic aspects. Being a part of nature, we cannot but perform as nature in nature's ways. As Joseph Campbell has said, the laws of the universe we carry within us. Being a human animal with investigative faculties, we examine nature from the macrocosm to the microcosm. We look each way from our middle dimension into the small dimension, the microscopic, into the large dimension, to find out more about ourselves and how we might better conduct ourselves in the entire natural scheme of things. We find, whether we wish to or not, that inescapably we are swathed in a total process. The architects then in various periods, and notably in the present time, have been strongly aware of this and have wisely come to incorporate organic principles into their design. After the demise of CIAM, which is an earlier period of the modern movement, they were movements away from that toward the organic aspects of architecture. Notably, Team 10, they endorsed the idea of life-generated design, not the mechanical aspect of design, not the building as the machine, but buildings as a response to the human occupant inside of them, using organic processes in place of previous static, finite relationships and function in space. Specifically, they spoke in biologic terms: root, branch, node, tissue, spine, and pod, which are now commonly understood references in our profession. They may be altogether common to you, but they were found and introduced in that particular time by Team 10, which was an international group of young architects who took over from the CIAM. After that, the Metabolist group in Japan, and then Peter Cook began to talk in terms of buildings as eggs, cocoon nests, orifices, sponges, layered skins, and these things become familiar to you. These are all organic references. This is what, when we use these, we feel very definitely a connection between our drawing and the concept we're doing and nature's processes. Liu Kahn even went so far as to understand that buildings were not only animalism, but spoke of buildings as possessing an existence will. The psychiatrists now call the anima, what the philosophers call the life principle or soul. He believed that buildings had souls. In what I believe was the most creative period, spoke of buildings as capable of self-knowledge and power of will, which at a certain stage of their design would assume the authority to dictate to the architect just how they willed themselves to be completed. Can you imagine? That's beautiful. That's listening. That's not saying, here's how my building's going to be. It's setting up, it's presiding over the flow of influences and how things come about, and then listening and saying, there's something the building has to say to me. Then it was not only alive in the animalistic sense, but it had a soul as well. This is a wonderful lesson to remember. Now, still another major effort was forged in connecting between man, his technology, and nature, was put forth by the French Jesuit I mentioned before, Pierre Teilhard de Chardin. A deeply religious man, he was concerned with how man should conduct himself following God's intentions in the face of an ever-advancing and fearsome technology. In his name, there has been established in London the Teilhard Center. Now get this, dedicated to a civilization increasingly responsible for its own evolution. Up to now, we say nature governs all things to do with evolution. But now man becomes so much in command of life, death, processes, this, that, controlling, using resources, destroying, building, and so, not to mention genetic engineering, that now we find him increasingly responsible for his own evolution, our own evolution. This is frightening, but beginning to be true. This is a stunning statement. In The Phenomenon of Man, his book, Phenomenon of Man, Teilhard presents then the fundamental theory that an understanding of the development of society demands that we regard the whole of mankind as one organism, which obeys the general laws of biology, and that these laws express themselves throughout history of man as a single great creative process. Teilhard sees urbanism as a positive factor. He's not afraid of city development. He says, get in there, understand it, keep your relatedness to nature, and you will not go wrong, no matter how sophisticated your technology may advance to be. One of the most significant books then recently published, called Regional Urbanisms, by a Swedish architect named Peter Broberg. I don't know whether you have that in your library or not. It was released by the Teilhard Review. This book is an interpretation of Teilhard's principles mentioned here, however, placed in architectural terms. Consistent with Teilhard's line of thought, Broberg says that the regional urban landscape will be described as a living macro system, or as a superhuman creature. He sees the connection of the biological of mankind and animal and the rest of nature and technology fusing together. This urban creature, or urbanism, is in fact seen as the next stage in our evolution. Urbanisms are further defined as organically planned regional centers and are to be regarded as members of a new biotech species. We are coming closer to our technology rather than further away. It is a part of us. We do not have to fear it in any way at all. Using the current technology, urban development then in the future must begin to follow organic laws. Now, the new physics is now accepted as a force in our lives today, has discarded the mechanistic universal model of Descartes and Newtonian physics and replaced it with the concept of organic interrelatedness, ecologic wholeness. The organic ecological worldview of Eastern philosophies is one of the main reasons for the immense popularity they have gained in the West, says Capra. Fritjof Capra, who is a great scholar and lives in San Francisco. There appears to be a growing belief that the new physics, technology, and social patterns may be brought together into some sort of organic unity. Our failure to feel our relatedness to nature in our lives and in our architecture cannot be forgiven as oversight or stupidity or even arrogance. The indictment is even more severe. It is a denial of what connects this humanity to the greater cosmos. The last of these three, the psychosocial imperative. Now, whereas in the time of Vitruvius, one might have spoken of the aesthetic aspects of architecture as delight, or as conventionally defined as that philosophy dealing with principles of beauty and good taste, we in this philosophic and psychologic age speak of aesthetics in terms both more precise and more profound. The psyche, as the dictionary notes, and this is worth listening to, go to the dictionary more often. The psyche, although part of the mental operations, is not simply a physically functioning entity, but that which has complex processes of its own. It is more than the mental process. And it governs the total organism, that is the animal or the human being, and its interrelatedness with its environment. The term psychosocial, then, I use here as representing the collective soul. We can't deal with literature, poetry, the arts, painting, or architecture, surely, without thinking of the human soul. Today, we know more about ourselves and our processes, and if the architect, like the artist and poet, is concerned with the collective soul, then he is obliged to develop an awareness of that psychic interaction between human beings and their environment, to understand the meaning implicit in the man-made environment he designs, and the effect which it exerts upon the occupants who interact with it. In addition, in his time, the architect should know the range of derivations from which meanings can be drawn, the sources of their power, their effective and appropriate application to their buildings. Carl Jung and Joseph Campbell, you know these references, I'm sure, more recently agree that mythology is always with us because it explains to us things about life which science cannot. Now, postmodern is sort of more concerned with meaning, symbolism, images, and that sort of thing. They haven't got very far with it. They have a lot more homework to do. I've done considerably more homework than they, and I can give you references to some rather basic and some rather useful facts. There's a difference then. There's a reason then that mythology is always with us, as technology is always with us. As Niels Bohr, the great Danish philosopher, said, speaking of science and art, they are separate truths which are different but compatible. They'll never come together, but we need them both. We could not endure with one and not the other. In his book, Myths to Live By, another book I would urge you to read, that has to do with mythology today, myths are telling us, says Campbell, that the powers of the psyche are to be recognized and integrated into our lives. Powers that will be common to the human spirit forever, and which represent that wisdom of the species by which man has weathered the millenniums. Campbell goes on to say, the importance of rights in our lives today, not only the formal rights of the church, diplomacy, government, and corporations, but in familistic functions within the home. What we fail to do is recognize that our rituals and rites and mythologies are still going on. I'll mention just one stunning thing to hold your mind to it. The prototypical hero which is always found in all mythology, is still with us. Today, who is it? It's John Glenn, who went to the moon and came back, and he's welcomed in Washington, D.C. The ritual is the motorcade, and the stage is Pennsylvania Avenue. We've got to wake up and see these things. Now, the thing that's lacking there is Pennsylvania Avenue. That's the architectural setting for this, and of course, it's a blowout. It's old-time buildings, it's neoclassic stuff. It's not the great stage that an architect might design for that occasion. It is my theory then that, not theory, is my belief, and I join with many others, that architecture has always been, is now, and forever will be then, the settings for the enactment of these rights. We don't just trick up our buildings with little mannerisms and things, as many postmodern fellows are doing. We examine what really are the basic experiences which are happening to us. The urban centers and buildings serve not only as shelters, but as it were theaters. Our public squares, city gates, inaugural platforms, shrines, churches, civic buildings, corporate headquarters, and most particularly homes are all, in a sense, theaters. You as architects can begin to see your buildings you're designing in an entirely new way if you see them as housing the rituals and the ceremonies and the habits and the tribal developments that we have and the personal expressions in our lives, and we house them then in theaters in which this enactment can take place. In his book, Man and His Symbols, Carl Jung then offers the stunning illustration in current terms, in which John Glenn is the archetypical hero. The mythology is the adventure into outer space and the return of the hero. The ritual is the motorcade, and to this I would add the architectural setting, or the theater, is Pennsylvania Avenue, Washington, D.C. In ancient Greece, the word personae meant mask. It was a theater prop. Personae means not person, it means pair through, sonai, sound. They spoke through a big mouth, but they covered their faces and they presented themselves then to the audience as something different. Their voices then were transmitted to the public. In the psychoanalytic field, personae, used today in the profession, means those images of ourselves we wish others to know us by. This personae, of course, takes the familiar forms of manner, dress, social memberships and possessions, and the buildings we occupy. The mask, then, may be held not only against the face, but to the building which represents us. This then explains, and even perhaps validates to this extent, the facade on the exterior of a building, and the period room on the interior as well, or as ornamentations of doorways and rooftops. What I'm doing is giving a huge moral support to postmoderns who are not bright enough to do research and put this together, even to support themselves. It is amusing to find the updated versions of this in Peter Cook's Instant Facades, quote, and Room Liners, quote, which may be a serious proposal for current architecture, but also humorous social commentary and biting satire. The Danish sociologist Hartwig Fritsch reminds us in our technic society, there is no longer any time to form traditions. What are we going to do about an oncoming architecture which happens like this, whereas development of architectural periods took hundreds and hundreds of years before? There is no time, he says, to form new tradition. We see a fragmentation of past cultures, a breaking down of them, and a reassembling them in any fashion at all. But we do have in exchange, we are stabilized as the life of the new socio-man by information exchange begins to build an international society in which we are then all members. When our concern is for architecture, it is important to make the distinction then between personal introverted mannerisms and those symbols which have meaning to others, to society, and to all of mankind. There is, in fact, some doubt in our profession today as to whether the images used by the so-called postmodernists are really accessible to the public at all. Graves has been honest enough to express some doubt about that himself. The true symbol, says Thomas Merton, another religious man, does not merely point to something else, a reminder of something else. Instead, it contains in itself a structure which awakens our consciousness to a new awareness of the inner meaning of life and reality itself. In the presence of true symbols, one is coming into contact with one's deeper self and the deeper self in others. In architecture, then, we cannot simply deal with personal effects, nor mannerisms, nor stylistic trappings, but must seek deeper meaning and communicate this meaning to a broad public. Another characteristic of craft architecture is that although it can, as we say, support a considerable amount of decoration, its most effective and essential quality is obviously that of form and space. It is then not decorative symbols, but spatial symbols which will always most strongly affect us. The philosopher Kant said, "Space and time are not only the a priori forms of sensibility, but are also preconditions of all experience, which exist in the senses even before birth." That's something to remember. We're pretty well equipped as infants before birth. We suck our thumbs, we move around, and we're equipped for a newly beating heart. Add to that, if you will, we have a sense of time and a sense of space. This is how well we are equipped then to understand the spatial relationships of things around us, whether between people, in our nursery. We are equipped then, all of us, to be architects or to understand and appreciate architects. That's an extraordinary statement. No wonder then the compelling effect that architecture has upon us. No wonder the force with which the silent voice of architecture can speak. Now, there's a dictionary of symbols, which you may want to rush out and buy right away. And I'll tell you, it is called the Dictionary of Symbols by I.E. Cirlot, C-I-R-L-O-T. In this, he mentions the spatial symbols, as those you may already know: the cave, the house, the forest, and others, the tower, and the bridge. The cave, which rather obviously represents a return to the prenatal state, and one's forthcoming as an experience of rebirth. The house, which is feminine, is the repository of wisdom. Its interior rooms and passages represent various levels of the psyche. The forest of trees, columns, or today perhaps the megastructure, reminds us of mystery, adventure into the unknown. The tower, in our time, the corporate skyscraper, can represent aspiration above the common condition or an overwhelming pride or hubris of power and control and wealth. Also, in this age, the rocket may be an updated version of the tower. The bridge in our time is not any longer the bridge, but it is a representation of leaving one state of reality and going into a suspended state of unreality and then down to the other side. This can be a bridge, if you like, in San Francisco, but the new updated version then, of course, is the airport and the airplane and the airport again at the other end. A departure from the perceived to that beyond perception, a leap from one reality through a suspension in time and space to another reality. Lewis Carroll's fantasy, in that fantasy, the White Queen says to Alice in Wonderland, "What kind of a memory is that only works backwards?" And as we have observed that myths are timeless, reaching backwards as well as forwards in time, and modern physics says that the past, present, and future are all the same, why is it then that postmoderns should look only backwards and limit themselves to nostalgic references to postmodern? But why are they not then delightful explorations into the future, consistent with the immensely popular realm of science fiction as seen in Star Trek and Tron? To sum this up then, the realms of the psyche, their vast implications for architecture, are far too important to the profession to be neglected in favor of personal indulgences, esoteric references, and the meaningless decoration appearing about us now. We would do well then to be guided by great minds such as Jung, Campbell, Merton, and others who understand the workings of the psyche, so as better to deal with, in architectural terms of space and form, with the psycho-social needs of our time. There is a great period ahead for architecture in which architects will rediscover true symbols and images in terms which, for us in our information age, have resonance, and with which we may then celebrate the mythology of our time. Now I'm going to put some slides on and try to illustrate this, which is really quite difficult, but let's have a bang at it. We'll turn the Can I? Very odd first slide. When I went to Harvard, when I was at Harvard College, I looked forward to going to the architectural school, and it was then 2 years before Walter Gropius and Breuer had arrived. And this is the kind of work they were doing then. I just barely escaped it. Those older than me, Lou Kahn, actually made drawings like this. It may be hard for you to believe. This then is the École des Beaux-Arts. It was known as art for art's sake. One of the guiding principles was that architecture was a tasteful arrangement of compositional elements. Following this with a big bang, of course, with the revolutionary modern. Zeilenbau, they call it in Germany, meaning all built alike. This is a city project by Hilbersheimer. It is really quite frightening. It's the most frightening slide I could find for you. And those two were probably the most extreme slides ever put together. But soon we had then what we call the machine aesthetic. This is Rietveld, I believe, not the boy who will speak to you, but the man probably 2 generations earlier. This then is the romantic expression of buildings which somehow recall mechanical parts. After CIAM, which is the international conference, of architectural, modern architecture, Team 10, a young group, took over. This then was a softening, as I said earlier, of the entire movement. It dealt with life and movement and circulation and growth and change as the bases for architectural design. This happens to be by Utzon. It's a very beautiful model. You can see nature behind this. You can see very much human quality moving in. This is Tange. This is metabolism. You can see then a change, movement toward a softening up. Here is a megastructure, high technology by Peter Cook, but highly romantic. It cannot be built. It's almost like a Piranesi drawing. It's a delight. Not sure that that would be a good life, but these were drawings of immense value, which were influential to others. Out of this megastructure came other megastructures. But this was the grim reality, as Rainer Banham said. They made the mistake of trying to impose an order on a disorderly world. This is, I think, the Dallas airport. Again, grim, inhuman, and mechanistic. To escape this, then, you see Peter Cook escapes into play and jest and humor. This, then, is Instant City, and the spirit was carried on. After many more expressions of freedom and delight, we move on to Graves' Portland building, which is pretty close to Beaux-Arts all over again. We have, within 50 years then, completed almost a complete cycle which is almost back to concern with art for art's sake and the tasteful arrangement of compositional elements. This reminds me, of course, I wonder how many cycles we must go through. Will there, after this, then become another period, revival of stern, revolutionary modern, and then do we have to go through it again? And will these recurrent cycles recur every 50 years, 10 years, 5, 2, 1, or whatever? It reminds me of that Walla Walla bird, that legendary bird that used to fly in concentric circles and ever increasing speeds until it flew up its own anus and disappeared. I don't know whether that's ahead for us or not, but I think someone's got to blow the whistle. A montage. Can we, do you think, find a common ground for two general directions that architecture has recently taken? Here's a statement by Tanguy. Tanguy has more recently said, I get the impression that a psychedelic happening style architecture, which may not be an architecture at all, but merely a way of arousing attention, resembles an infant who wants to say something, but lacking words can only gurgle and goo. Opposed to this is an extremely cool and thorough, although sometimes called soft, approach that thinks only in terms of structures and systems and attempts to ravel their intricacies by means of computers. Purely abstract or theoretical thinking like that of Archigram Group is impossible to put into concrete form. Sometimes the ideas themselves look impossible. Although separate, these two approaches are not unrelated, and it may well be that great significance can result from a kind of wedding of the infant goo and the aloof calculations of structure and composition. This meaning will be more than words, it may be a whole architecture. I put these together forcibly to show that both might go on at the same time, that we perhaps are developing a composite architecture which combines both, in which we have as the framework and structural and services aspect of architecture taken care of one way, and that will advance while we retreat more and more into cozy theater design. Now, we do live in a time of telecommunications, which are immensely impressive. We live in a time of satellites. We live in a time of total recall in which we can bounce images off of satellites and back again to any part of the earth. And we then are back to what Hartwig Fritsch, the Danish cultural historian, has said, has observed that they're developing, that in the nature society, first of all, when early man was replaced, a nature society, which was existent in the case of the caveman, early man, was replaced by a culture society developing in many separate regions and after many centuries of habit forming. That is the Oriental tradition, African tradition, the European tradition, and so, separate. Finally, they have met, and in this technic society, it says, they have all come together, and we have no longer a chance to form habits anymore. In this information age, then, technology breaks the barriers between the separate cultures, but it is also unifying further cultural development, binding all mankind together. This is a city strip by a fellow named Weber, 1965. It could be one of many. It is frame and infill. In other words, this continuity is still carrying on. But what they've given up is the megastructure, which proved to be brutal and inhuman, and they have exchanged that then for what they call the omni-building, giving up the mega or great, but taking on the omni, which means all inclusive. This then is a whole town or a neighborhood. This then is an ongoing tendency, and we can observe that in this development in San Francisco, which is a 4-block development complete with services and interchange on many levels. We can also see this in the City Core building in New York City, where we have developed what I might call an undergrowth in organic terms, not only a tree, but growth of things below it. Here then is developed to the great advantage of commercial interests, development of spaces at minus 20 feet, minus 10 feet below level, 0 or street level, plus 10 and plus 20. Those now become 5 different levels of commercially viable space. This then is the building of this idea of an omni-building. Now, let's go to the sets and stage scenery aspect of this thing. Here is indeed a authentic stage set. This is Mozart's Magic Flute. This is a lobby by Isozaki, very much the same. This is a showroom by Michael Graves. Here's a very good one. This is the Court of Appeals in Seattle. I went out there on a jury and I gave this an award with other architects. We gave both the building that this was in an award, and we gave this stage set award as well. The point I'm making is that you can see in the upper strip of windows on the left the windows of the outer building. And before this, you see then a perfect setting for the processes of law. This is then is a stage or a theater in which we conduct the processes of law. It's a perfect setup. There's a place for the jury, for the accused, for the defendant, for witnesses, and the judge at the top. It is a stage set. This is then a simulation. This is a projection by C. Ray Smith. This is very amusing. In his own apartment, which is very meager and small, he projects on this the entire interior of the Sistine Chapel. Here we have a personalized interior. The trend reporters, John Naisbitt and others, tell us to be ready for far more personalized interiors, greater choice, and greater exhibition of judgment and poor taste. However, this is somebody's bathroom. We have architecture within architecture. Alvin Toffler, the other one, a futurist, has made other statements which have to do with choice, with change, with adjustment, with personal involvement in the architecture. As Naisbitt says, we're working away from representational democracy to participation democracy. And that will happen, of course, in architecture too. Representational architecture is when you as a client or homeowner are represented by an architect. He sees that changing, and more, although architects will not become extinct, more and more homeowners will be designing their own houses, and that I think is all for the good. Another little note that Naisbitt has in his book, Megatrends, is do it yourself. You see a lot of this these days. It's a charming little cabin somewhere in the West here, I believe. In Los Angeles, here you are. This is right out of the newspaper. Perhaps you have seen this. These are architects as style. These then can be changed. We're coming very close, you see, to stage design on the exterior as well as the interior. I go one step further, of course, and I'm designing a model for a resort hotel in Miami Beach, in which these are prefabricated rooms. There are 6 there, 2, 2, and 2, and you can't quite see the sign over there that says six-pack. That's a reference, of course, to 6 cans of beer. They're turned out of the factory in that way. But the joke is, and I'm carrying this one step beyond what the postmoderns have done, when you make a reservation for this hotel, you call up and get your room, and they ask you what kind of a facade you want. And you tell them you want Venetian Gothic, or you want American Colonial, whatever. And then they ask, well, what kind of a room liner do you want? I say, do you want it consistent with the outside? And if you want to play, of course, you can have it totally inconsistent. And then if you want, at the desk, you can pick up a costume. So this is, of course, total escapism. But this is the kind of the world we're in right now. Then we have, of course, this marvelous drawing by Jim Wines, which is, again, self-expression.